Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Vidyashilp Academy, Meha, and Seagull Foundation for Art for this rare opportunity. So I'm going to repeat my Calcutta presentation. So Meha and Abir, please bear with me. My presentation is much connected to yesterday's discussions and today's morning discussions. So if you can able to connect with that, I think it will be wonderful. Okay, let me start with this national flag of Sri Lanka. So because this, I consider the whole, the conflict. So my presentation is based on my 4 art projects based on the conflict. My whole argument is that the conflict is a product of misinterpretation of history. So let me start with this whole politics, understanding the Sri Lankan national flag. A lot of Indian friends used to say to me, it's a beautiful flag, but let's see whether it's really beautiful. So do you know anything about this, about the colors or representation or symbolism in this, like the way you interpret Indian flag? No. Okay. So it's also interesting. I know the symbolism of Indian flag. So yesterday we were talking about India and Pakistan. Yes. So this is like initially when the nation was formed, they proposed an ancient flag from a kingdom, which is having a kind of a lion flag. Then they wanted that they included 4 corners, this bow leaves, to represent Buddhism. Then later on, there was a kind of question from the minorities where we are in these things. Then they added this green and yellow to represent Tamils and Muslims. But interestingly, after doing all these things, the lion with the flag, lion with the sword is looking at the minorities. So this is so it's like interestingly. So even the whole making of this flag is also representing a kind of a conflict. So one of the Sri Lankan historian in his recent book mentioned that in that book he mentioned that the innocents who lost their lives as a direct consequence of misrepresentation of history, in his history book. So interestingly, so let me take you to the kind of violent history. Before taking you to the kind of a violent history we faced with in last 30 years, in Sri Lanka, like in many other countries, because of colonialism and nationalism, the nation making or production of a nation and the production of history is like linked very closely. So in the process, the Sri Lankan nation become a kind of a singular Buddhist nation, and to argue that, to make it feasible, there is also a kind of a history writing project involving erasure of minority histories. So yesterday in my group discussion, I mentioned how India is represented in Sri Lankan histories. We don't talk about contemporary India as much, but ancient India is very important to us, but not the whole India, but the Buddhist India. Buddhist India also, not the South Indian Buddhism, but the North Indian Buddhism. There is also a kind of a myth, that the Aryan myth, which operated in the making of history. So the Sinhalese identify, the Buddhists identify them with Aryans of the South India, or of the North India. But if you look at the features and the language group and all these things, it's much a South Indian version than kind of a North Indian one. So that's the way they imagine. So they relate them with Gupta or Maurya, but not with Chola or Pallava. Chola, Pallava, but we have ruins related to these areas, these periods, and also Buddhist monuments related to Chola. But interestingly, Sri Lankan history books interpret South India as invaders, South Indians as invaders, but not as North Indians. But the whole country's history, starting with the whole civilization history of civilization in Sri Lanka, starting with the Vijaya story, a mythology. Vijaya came from Bengal. So it's interesting. When Vijaya came, there was a kind of an indigenous group already living in Sri Lanka. So when they interpreted that story, they never seen that as a kind of a colonizing Sri Lanka by Bengalis. But when it's happened when it's come to Chola, then they interpreted that as they are the conquerors of the country. So it's very complicated. So, and in the process, there are two concepts very important. One is called singular Deepa, that's called the singular island, and the other one is the Dharma Deepa, that is the island of the Buddhist doctrine. So these two things colluded together and brought a new Sri Lankan nation, which is singular Buddhist. Unlike India, Sri Lanka in its constitution, there's a kind of special preferences or special allocation for Buddhism in the constitution. So in this whole process, actually, like if you look at the whole, there is also like in the process of making the nation, if you look at the history of riots in Sri Lanka, like in the pre-independent Sri Lanka, there was first riots against Catholics, then the second riots against Muslims, third riots against Malayalis. And there is no Malayalis now in Sri Lanka. Either Malayalis become Tamils or Sinhalese, or they moved out of Sri Lanka. And also there were a good number of Telugu speakers and Kannada speakers in Sri Lanka in pre-colonial Sri Lanka. We have photographic evidences and other documents. So in the end, after the independence, it became totally, they were against the Anglo-Ceylonese. So the Anglo-Ceylonese started moving out of the Sri Lanka. Then the third phase happened with cycles of violence against Tamils. Now the war is over. Now the whole focus is against Muslims. Now every month we are having reports against burning of mosque, attacking Muslims, and all these things. So you can see how. So I think this is because of the school textbooks, and not only school textbooks, it's also media and all these things, and the Buddhist establishment, how they are interpreting history. So that is a kind of a real problem. Okay, to give a kind of a context to my artwork, so it's like in 1948, like Sri Lanka emerged as a kind of independent state after 400 years of European colonial rule. Unlike India, we were under 400 years of colonial rule under Portuguese, Dutch, and British. Then there is a kind of then the whole shift. There is a kind of majority in politics, closer to democratic politics. Then the whole situation changed. Then there was a kind of a claim for separate homeland. You know all these about, and then the creation of LTTE. I think it's also very historical. So creation of LTTE, and they fought for a separate land. And in that whole civil war, 30 years of civil war, Sri Lanka, like more than 3 lakhs of innocents died. I'm not calculating the army or the LTT cadres in this. And also thousands of people disappeared or missing. Still their families are searching. And also there is no single family from the north and eastern part of Sri Lanka, which was a war front, without a kind of an experience of displacement. In 2009, war came to an end by the government's most crucial military initiative by killing more than 4,000 innocents and displacing nearly 5 lakhs of people. And after that winning of the war, there were celebrations like the one happened in Kargil's. And also the minorities are not allowed to do mournings, or there was no commemoration. So there was a total ban on minorities doing commemoration of the loss of their relatives. And also there was like a kind of the LTT memorials or LTT cemeteries all over north and east. They were bulldozed and vacuum cleaned. At the same time, government and the military forces were building their own memorials and victim memorials all over the north and eastern part of Sri Lanka. These are some of the examples from those sites. So it's again In the morning talk, she mentioned about, Arundhati mentioned about power and who is having the power to write the history. So the connection between the power and the history. And so, the whole, even the memorialization project, even in the post for Sri Lanka, is linked with that whole power discourse. So if you look at, like the flag, if you look at carefully about the symbolism appearing in this, the alliance are there. And so it's like it's very clearly delineate the minorities from the majorities. And also, after winning the war, the government said, after this, there is no minorities and majority in the country. There are people who love the country and people who are betraying the country. That's the kind of a discussion they brought in. So you can't bring any kind of a discussion or criticism about the existing history. And the second phase was, they found Buddhist sites. This is a kind of a megalithic sites in Jaffna, and turned into a Buddhist site. So it's a pre-Buddhist site become a Buddhist site. And they also started installing new Buddhist temples all over the minority areas, which is with the connection of some sort of mythology. So this is a site in Jaffna. It's a newly built Buddhist temple, which this area was under Navy. And the mythology is connecting to this site is like Sangamita brought the boat tree from India to Sri Lanka. So Sangamita landed in this place. So they built a new temple, but there's no historical evidence. That's the only myth. So in that process, and also there's a kind of a pilgrimages and cycles of other war touring all happening. So through this process, this myth become a kind of a history. Okay, let me start with my four. So in this context, I did like 3-4 works as a kind of a response to response to my immediate surrounding. I never thought of doing a presentation in a history conference, and similarly, someone I think in 2009, I got an invitation from Vancouver to do a project for them using the same methods I'm using. So they said they are concentrating on artists using anthropological tools to make art. That is a project is about. So they invited me to do that. Until that, I didn't realize that I'm using an anthropological tool to make an art. Similarly, when Megha called me regarding the history conference, I found it's well fit into my whole practice. And I never thought that I'm also making a different kind of history for different kind of people. Similarly, Asian Art Archive called me for archiving as art project as archiving. So I never thought that there is a kind of an archiving element in this whole thing. So for me, as an artist, I'm reacting to the situation. So, so now I'm just putting it in the other way around from the history and the material kind of a perspective that how these works are working. But when I conceive this work, I conceive that's a kind of an art project. Okay, so in 2004, there was a kind of there was a war, and there was a sudden stop in the war because of kind of a Norwegian peace talk happening between LTT and the government. So I made use of that time, and I did a work called History of Histories. So in which I went and collected 500 objects with my students from randomly collected homes, representing their memories or histories. We asked individuals to give any objects that has a story behind of the 25 years, that time it was 25 years of existence in the war zone. And we also exhibited that in the public library of Jaffna, which was burned by the government in 1987, 86. And partly it's also kind of, it was also fueling the whole conflict, because this was considered to be one of the best libraries in South Asia with all palm leaf records and things like that, which cannot be, you can't recover. So, so that library was whitewashed and rebuilt. Then the bookshelves was empty without any books. So we had an exhibition in that library. This is the way we exhibited. So the bookshelves with those objects collected from 500 homes. So objects varies, like a broken limb of a doll, like shell pieces, empty bullets, water, barbed wire, death certificates, identity cards, keys of the houses which cannot be approachable. So it's, with that, in 2009, as I told you, I got another invitation to work in Vancouver. Actually, they were asking me to exhibit the same work in Vancouver. At that time, war restarted, and most of the material we exhibited were prohibited. So you can't show them, and it's against Sri Lankan war regulations. So I can't transport that to Vancouver. So it's interesting. Certain materials has to go to, like, underground in that case, and this work cannot be in public. So in that peace time, this can be exhibited and can be discussed, but later on it cannot be. So in that case, then we were discussing about the possibilities, and then we come to the conclusion, I will repeat the whole project in Vancouver with Tamil diaspora. So then I did a work on Tamil diaspora, slightly shifting my focus from home to homemaking, how diaspora imagine or imaging home in Vancouver. This was the exhibit. So there I collected 300 objects in similar manner, and I also brought the element of travel because they gone through different cycles of because some are illegally immigrated, some are legally immigrated. So they also gone through different customs and surveillance and all kinds of things, how these things modify their memory and history, and what kind of objects they took with them, and what all the things they left behind. So in Vancouver, this museum, this anthropology museum, they didn't have a kind of a Sri Lankan collection, even though now they have a significant amount of Punjabi and Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora living in Vancouver. There is no representation from these communities. So when I started working with that community, they found they got a chance to exhibit their history in the Vancouver Museum. So getting a space in the museum, so getting a space in the history. So that is their project is about, which I never thought about. So identity cards, tumblers, palm leaf horoscope, photographs. So in this, so it's like a kind of this display is like a kind of museum queue or a kind of a laboratory queue display, in which the individual stories are allowed to collude with each other and transform the personal into public. Encourage, so these are personal stories, and it's become public. And also it's invite the viewer to imagine their own home. When I did this project, Vancouver Museum actually tried to do another project, inviting all the school children to the site to imagine their own home. Yeah, so that so these individual stories, when we put together, it's become a kind of a collective. It's brought a kind of a collective image about home. And also, it's like there is also a kind of it's also started working with their memory and history and bring out a kind of a transformation from personal to public. Then in 2012, I did a project called The Incomplete Tombu. It's an artist book project, present in a kind of a bureaucratic document file containing 80 documents of civilian displaced from the northern part of the island during the civil conflict between 1983 and 2009, presently living either in Sri Lanka or abroad. This project records the stories that remove civilians from their homes and the memories that they took with them. This is the book. Let me explain a bit about the Tombu, the word Tombu. Tombu means public register or register of land. The word Tombu is a common word in among Sinhala and Tamil-speaking communities in Sri Lanka. It's derived from the Greek word tom, meaning a section, mostly like a papyrus, which gave rise to the Latin word tome, or large book. Later, Portuguese and Dutch used this term for their earlier forms of land register or deeds. So I started working with that. So the colonial document talk about the boundaries in terms of, talk about the property in terms of the boundaries that share with others. So it's other is very important to make your own property. Here I started working with the emotion. I started looking at the emotional boundaries of the lost property. So in this project, in the earlier two projects, I actually worked as a kind of a curator. I was just collecting objects and displaying it. Here I thought I should bring my own interest and my own capability of doing drawings, and also bring people into it directly, like the way I did it before, not representing them, actually working with them. So in that case, so how to bring individuals into this project? And so I thought it's a kind of drawing book project. So how to bring their drawings into the project? So I actually went and asked people to draw the ground plan of their houses, which they lost. So while started drawing the ground plan, they started telling the story. Then I started collecting the story. So the story collection also happened not as a kind of recording or something. I started like gathering the story to found an image of that lost property. And then I started remembering and rewriting after I go home or something like that. There is also kind of an element of remembering and forgetting involved in that. So what I found in that, why I chosen to work with the ground plan of the house is also very important. Because what I found from my own experience is like displacement produce a kind of an extraordinary emotional meaning to the house architecture. So when they moved, they only carry with this kind of a ground plan, and all of them are having some sort of an ability to draw a kind of a ground plan. So anyone can draw, so that I thought that could be an interesting entry point. Also, it became a kind of a method, because during the war, a lot of people went to these affected people and asked information about their houses, for compensation, other kind of aid programs, and documentation, other purposes. So people also having a kind of a tendency to stitch their stories according to the listener. So when you go, it's also very difficult to find the real truth behind the story. So this tool, they never expected. So they were telling the story without knowing. They were actually drawing. And while drawing, they were explaining to me that has happened to that house or their relatives or something like that. So it's become a very interesting tool to locate them. So the book looked like this. The first page is having so all 80 stories are having 4 documents. First is my response to their story, a visual response to their story, my drawing, like this. Second is a kind of architectural map produced by the computer. Then third is a kind of a map drawn by them. Fourth is a kind of extract from their story. Okay, let me read some of the stories so that you can get a kind of a flavor of it. I was a small child when we were displaced in 1990. We walked nearly 15 kilometers to reach Jaffna. My family members carried household things that were portable. Since I was small, they told me to carry my pet puppy. I carried him because he was too small to walk that distance. A few days after we reached Jaffna, the puppy dies. We got notice to leave our village without delay because of the advancement of government troop. My grandfather could not bear it. He died the same day. We left the village immediately after his body was cremated. It is hard to nature jasmine creeper in the heavy winters of Toronto. I covered the plant with a blanket and kept it inside the house. Last summer, it yielded 4 flowers. Their fragrance brought me back to my Jaffna house. We had to leave our house because of the advancement of troops in 1990. My father carefully locked the doors and brought all the keys with him, with the hope of return. Now almost 20 years have gone by, and my father passed away a few years back without seeing his house. We still have the keys of the house, even though it and my father no longer exist. I have my ancestral house in Jaffna. My elder sister's marriage took place in that house. Now it's a military training camp. Once, when my family visited, we received guest treatment in our own house. We sat in our drawing room, tasting cool drinks and biscuits. Later, when I attempted to see the house, my request was rejected on the grounds that I did not have right. Now I watch my sister's wedding video to see my own house. Now I am living in Toronto with my family, but my childhood memories are more closely associated with the house in Jaffna. There is no trace of my house now. I used to look at my empty land from Canada using Google Maps. My father died when we were small. My mother struggled to feed 7 children. I started working in paddy fields when I was 8 years old. My elder brother, who was helping my mother to raise the family, was shot dead by the Indian Army. My elder sister is married and living in Switzerland. My younger brother is in France. Now I am working in the university. One of my sisters was an LTT cadre and was killed in 1995 during the military operation. My other 2 sisters are married. One of them was badly injured in the last phase of 1 year war. Both my sisters' husbands lost their legs in the same war. The house that I live now came under the air attack in 1990. It was the first night air raid by the Sri Lankan government. Everything in the house was destroyed. I lost all my toys that I had kept since I was a child, and all the glass bangles that I had kept in the wooden boxes. I have since rebuilt my house, but there are no toys and bangles to call it home. Since the late 80s, due to the heavy shelling from the Palale Air Base, we had to move out of our house many times and stay in neighboring villages. During that time of our final expulsion in 1990, we were in the process of building a new house. One of the most disturbing incidents during the expulsion was that we couldn't take our pregnant Jersey cow with us. We had no other option other than to abandon her in the cattle shed. We never knew what happened to her. I have resettled in our own house after nearly 20 years. I was displaced in Puttalam. Everything has changed here. My street does not look like it did before. Most of those who were displaced have yet to return. Even the refugee camp in Puttalam, we live with our relatives and friends. Now I am living with strangers. I am a stranger in my own street. Through these art projects, actually, the art projects actually collages of diversified contexts, identities, memories, histories of lost home, and different mechanism of homemaking. So through these projects, actually, there is a kind of a common element of feeling of loss. Actually, that actually make so it's also an attempt to rebuild the community based on that feeling of loss, common loss. Then in 2016, I did a new work called Cabinet of Resistance. It's contained 25 resistance stories of the community. This was exhibited in Kochi Biennial. It's looked like it's in the form of a library index box. So all the stories are in these index box as in a kind of a index cards. So you can see this. It's all the stories are typed, and in between there are also drawings and other documents inserted. I will read one or two examples of these stories of resistance of different people. Shrine and sandbags. Sandbags were crucial during the war to protect us from aerial bombing and sniper attacks. Fertilizer bags and sacks were commonly used for making sandbags. But in the last phase of war, there was a heavy shortage for these sacks because people did not carry them when they were displaced. People who were trapped in the final days of war were displaced many times. With every displacement, the number of things that they could carry become lesser and less. People carried items that were needed for their day-to-day survival, and items that have sentimental value. They sold their gold jewelry during the different stages of displacement out of the need to purchase food items such as rice, coconut, milk powder for children. Most of the married women carried their bridal saris, their most prestigious property, especially for their sentimental value. To safeguard themselves and their families from the shelling and air raids, they gave their expensive silk bridal sari with gold and silver thread to make sandbags. The other story is Sivaraj's story, Sivaraj and the radio. The distance between Jaffna and Colombo is 394 kilometers, and it's nearly 7 to 8 hours away by train or bus. When the LTT took over the control of the entire northern part of Sri Lanka, the main road and the main road that connects it to the capital Colombo was closed. No direct transport was available. People had to travel to Colombo for many reasons. They took the risk of traveling dangerous routes, crossing landmines, jungles, lagoons, and no-man zones. Many of them died when they were caught in the crossfire in the areas between no-man zones and the LTT and the government control areas. Travel to Colombo sometimes took 4 days or more. People would inform their families in Jaffna via letter that they have reached Colombo safely. There were no telephone or telegram facilities available at the time. Letter could take more than a month to reach Jaffna, depending on the schedule of the ship service. With a great difficulty, it was possible to tune into broadcast from the state-owned radio station. Due to the shortage of batteries and lack of power supply, people only use radio for listening to the news at 6:30 a.m., 12:45 p.m., 6 p.m., and 9 p.m. After every new transmission, the radio would broadcast the daily obituary announcement. Those that reach Colombo safely send their own obituary notice to the radio station. When their relatives in Jaffna heard their names, they celebrate their safe passage to Colombo. The last one is a mechanic story. For more than 10 years, the government stopped supplying petrol. As a result of petrol engine vehicles were abandoned. But there were a limited supply of kerosene. So we converted petrol engine into kerosene engines. By following the functions of the tractor engine, we fixed 3 or 5 cascades and converted the petrol engine into a kerosene engine. The cascades reduced the compression. I converted many British-made cars such as Morris Minor, Morris Oxford, A30, A40, A90, Austin Cambridge, and Somerset in this manner. For a while, we had to mix vegetable cooking oil or gingerly oil or basia oil with engine oil, and in some cases, coconut oil with engine oil to tune the engine. During this time, there was also a shortage for spare parts for these converted British cars. I used parts of condemned vehicles as spare parts for the cars running in running condition. Occasionally, we also made our own separate parts by casting spare parts by casting them in aluminium or iron. Thank you very much.
So, a wonderful speech there, but I have one question which is more like an inquiry. Oh, wait. I would like to know, in the beginning you mentioned something about Malayalis and Tamilians, the communal hatred between each other. I just wanted to know that aggression which was caused, was that politically influenced? Because that has been a theme which we have kind of discussed. So, could you tell if it was?
Yeah, it's like yesterday we were talking about how Bangladesh is moving away from the secular state to the Muslim state, and how Pakistan is formed, and what is happening in India now. So that has started in Sri Lanka very silently, like 50 years ago. Through this riot process, it's become a pure, singular Buddhist state.
So no other religion or language
It's accepted in the constitution, but through this project, they are wiping the whole minority history. And also, like in terms of Buddhism, if you look at the sect, The Buddhism which the Sinhalese follow is called Theravada. But in South Indian Buddhism, it's Mahayana. But we found a lot of Mahayana sites in Sri Lanka, which is connected to South India. But interestingly, the South Indian history is silent about the Buddhist history. So that part is a kind of a vacuum. So then within that only the Sri Lankan state exists. The whole history exists. If we start digging the South India, then automatically the other part of the Buddhism come into surface in Sri Lanka. So there is a kind of a silence. They said it's a Buddhist sites, but if you see in terms of rituals, in terms of their doctrine, it's not at all connected.
Thanks, sir.
I just wanted to check with you, what's the socio-economic ramifications of what you have been saying now? Is it still, even till today, does it have some effect? Yeah, it must be having some effect, but I just want to know deeper into what kind of socio-economic ramifications the entire episode has.
If you look at the 1920s and 30s records, there was a kind of the first anti-sentiments come with the Buddhist reformist. They were anti-Tamil, anti-Indian, anti-Muslim because they found most of the economical things are under the control of the minorities. And still, if you look at the Colombo demography, it's like 60% of Colombo is non-Sinhalese. So it's like, and the major business establishments owned by the minorities. So they found these riots and other kinds of things may be able to wipe off the whole thing. And also the plantation, which gave a kind of a big support to the kind of a country's economy, is supported by the South Indian Tamil migrants in 19th century brought by the Britishers. But interestingly, if you look at the Sri Lankan living standards, they were in a kind of much lower level compared to other parts of Sri Lanka. Even the standards in the war-affected areas are much better than the plantation area.
Just very quickly, how do you, what has been your procedure, or not procedure, but process of selecting these stories? Like how many people did you talk to, and what will eventually go into this? How did you?
Yeah, that's interesting. So a number is decided by the site or the size of the book or the size of the site we were planning to exhibit. The initial project, History of Histories, actually I was teaching art history. And the art history students are not capable, because I think this information may be very helpful to you. I was teaching art history, and that 4 students who were my special students, they don't know how to draw or paint or anything about it. So I was teaching 70s art and conceptual art in the West. So then I was talking about how the whole notion of art changed. Art's become an idea, and there's no skill involved in that. And so we were like thinking, then I told, why can't we do an art project? Like, you don't have a skill, but you have an idea. So let's start. So then what we did was like 4 of them plus me, 5 of us. So then we divided that into hundreds. So I have to collect 100 objects. That what I did was, I will select 10 people, and that 10 people will bring 10 objects. So it's a kind of rhizomic process. So you are also making a community through that. So that 10 people go and talk to them and bring that stories to these people. And one of us will bring the story to the... Similar thing I did it in Vancouver also. So the 500 came, so 100 stories, because generally you know 100 people. One person may know 100 people. That is a kind of general idea. So that through your whole socialization, you can find your own material. That is number 1. In Vancouver, it's also the size and also the community and all that time frame make it as 300. In the book project, why 80 stories means I was just collecting. I was aiming at between 60 and 100 stories. But when it's reached 80, I found it's a very comfortable book, having all kinds of stories. So I thought I'll stop here, because the size of the book decide the whole thing. And also like the stories, people ask me that where am I in this whole project? Because my story is not there. And what is my role in this? So I'm an insider. So my story is there in every stories. Like, I'm expressing myself through their stories.
Hello, sir. Yesterday we just came to know like how history was misinterpreted in Bangladesh and Pakistan. My question is, how was Sri Lankan textbooks as interpreted Buddhism? Like we have like King sent his son and daughter to spread Buddhism. So that is how we came to know that Buddhism was spread in Sri Lanka by the children of Ashoka, that is Priyanka and Mahendra. So how is Sri Lankan textbook interpreted about Buddhism?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the North Indian part is there without many problem. But the South Indian part, because if you, like, the history is also having, like, based on the evidence. But the most of the evidence we are getting from Anuradhapura or Polonnaruwa, it's also, those sites are made by the South Indians. So it's still, there is a kind of interesting example. After this Afghanistan, this Taliban blasted that Bomian Buddhist sites, there were a kind of a group of students went into a Buddhist monk and asked, can't we do anything for this? Then they decided to have a huge, gigantic Buddha, build a gigantic Buddha in Sri Lanka. So that time, Sri Lankan High Commissioner was very helpful for them. And they also did their local fundraising. With that help, they built a huge Buddha. Now it's available. Now you can visit that site in Kurunagala. It's interesting that the sculptor is from Tamil Nadu. And that same sculptor, just 5 years before, built a huge Hanuman temple in the hill country. So the same sculptor built a Hanuman statue and the Buddha statue. We look at history from the dynasty, from the kings. But we don't look at from the craftsman point of view. We don't look at the history from the patronage, other kinds of patronage. So I think this may be an interesting point to look at. This, even in medieval Sri Lanka, this may be the case. So when they talk about Buddhism, they talk about Buddhism as a kind of a category totally came from North India. And also they build up their new stories or the local myths. Like Buddha 4 times visited Sri Lanka flying over the sky. And there is no text in India talking about that miracle. And interestingly, if you look at where Buddha visited, the places where Buddha visited only the minority sites, contemporary minority sites. So these myths are like after 30s, after 20s, these are modern myths. And so there was a myth in like 1920s, they started these myth making, and there are art projects. They started big mural projects with painting these images of Buddha visiting. So art became a kind of a tool to collude these history and the myth. There is no distinction between history and the myth. So if you go to the Buddhist temple, the walls are painted with all the mythology and country's history, Sri Lanka's history, Buddhist history, Buddha's history, all painted together, and the myth. So in the end, you don't feel what you don't see because it's all in one style. Then it's all become one. So in their psyche, it's like whether they are a citizen or a nationalist or a worshipper, that distinction is no more existing.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, what I was asking is that we can see an ideological clampdown on the minorities before the war and post the war to the war memorials. So, as an outsider from India, something what was seen as hopeful was the defeat of Rajpaksha and basically the regime change. So has anything changed on the ground in the government's attitude or ideology towards the minorities?
Yeah, this government change also is like influenced by the forces outside Sri Lanka, including India. So it's like, so there is a kind of significant change. There is a space to discuss. There is a space to dissent, which is very important. But I don't think we can stop with that. Because there is also a kind of because this government is not having a support of majority. It's also came into power with the support of minorities. So some certain crucial decision they are not in the position to take, which is kind of I don't know whether this will give a kind of long-lasting peace.
So it was a very interesting presentation, sir. I just had a doubt regarding the flag which you had explained. does the yellow background in the flag hold any significance?
That is like a whole nation. It's holding together. That's a framework.
The
Yellow
part.
frame. You're talking about the frame.
Yeah,
yes,
yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir.